In this video, we're going to talk about tone and mood in reference to literature. But first I want to start with a comparison between the two because often they get mixed up. So let's start with tone. The tone is the writer, narrator, or speaker's implied attitude toward his subject and audience. This may shift over the course of a text. So this is how the author or the speaker, who is sometimes hard to pull away from the author, because if we have a first-person narrator, we're really getting his or her tone. But yeah, this is the tone, this is the attitude toward the subject. Mood, on the other hand, is the general atmosphere created by the author's words, the feeling the author intends the reader to experience. And again, this may change from situation to situation. We may start off in a really happy birthday party, and then on the walk home, maybe the character gets lost in a graveyard and the mood totally changes. So both of these, you can see how they're very similar. They have to do with feeling, but they are different. There is a difference between the two, and you need to understand that in order to understand how they function within a text. So again, tone is the writer, narrator, or speaker's implied attitude towards his audience and subject, his or her. Writer would be if the writer was really, you could tell how the writer felt about something. Narrator would be in a piece of fiction that wasn't a poem. And the speaker is often in a poem, we refer to the character that's saying I or me, that's the speaker in a poem. So this is the attitude toward the subject and audience. Identifying tone. So here are some tips to find out what the tone of a piece might be. In order to understand meaning, we need to understand tone. If we don't get what the author's tone is, we might totally misunderstand a text. We could see this in a case where an author was being sarcastic. We might think that they actually mean what they're saying, and it might totally throw us off. That's just a very simple example of something that could throw us off a lot of different ways. In order to identify tone, we need to have careful objective reading. I like to focus on the word objective because maybe if we disagree with the author's viewpoint, we might think that they're being biting or harsh or too intense, when really they're being objective. We might feel like it's harsh because our opinion is clouding our minds. We need to really closely look at their choice of words, the way they're forming their sentences to see, is this actually too harsh or biting, or is it actually really objective and we just disagree? Which you're very welcome to do, but it doesn't help you identify tone. To find the tone, these are some things you can look at. The connotation of the words selected. So the author chooses words carefully. So let's talk about what connotation is. If I'm talking about the connotation of a word, so let's say I say, that model looks slender. Right? I choose the word slender. You probably imagine a very beautiful model, great body, looks awesome, right? But if I say that model looks gaunt, it means the same literal thing, but if someone is gaunt, that means that they're very skinny. It's like they're too skinny. Maybe you imagine that she has ribs sticking out and that she doesn't look healthy. Both of those mean skinny. Both slender and gaunt mean skinny, but the connotation of the word is different. So take a look at those connotations. What connotation did the author choose to use and which words that they chose? What kind of images are we getting? The same kind of thing here. If they're giving us very ominous images, the image of a gravestone, the image of something more dark and dreary, maybe of bats or something like that. Or if they're giving us the image of a beautiful sunny day and sunshine, that's different. That might help us identify the tone. If we're talking about a nonfiction piece, there can be tone in that as well, especially a personal essay. So if they're trying to make a point, for example, they're trying to make a point about hunting, right? There's an essay, it's about hunting. This also applies to the images thing. They might include facts about hunting that support their point. So maybe if they're supporting hunting in their essay, they're saying it helps with population control, people are using the meat for their own purposes, and they include those facts. They don't include the fact that, they don't give you a graphic description of them gutting the deer that would disturb most people. If they were on the opposite side, they probably would give you that gutting of the deer. Or maybe they would give you an image of a little girl whose dog was accidentally shot in a hunting accident. That would be an image and a fact that they would include in order to make their point. The tone has a lot to do. Remember, we're looking for the author's attitude towards the subject. So we're looking for the author's attitude for this example, hunting. The images, the facts, all that stuff that's included is going to help us figure that out. The overall use of language, if they're using formal language, if they're using slang or informal language, if they're using clinical terms, how does that come into the way we talk about tone? When we take a look at some of the tone words you can choose, you can see how maybe something like clinical language would help you choose. We also have to remember whose tone are we looking for. So if your teacher asks you to look for the author's tone, that's the author. It's the person who wrote the text. If a teacher asks you to look for the narrator or speaker's tone, that we want to make sure we know who we're talking about. Because, for example, in the story Love, we are getting the tone of that speaker, that narrator, because he's the only voice that we're hearing. So that is important to think about as well. We can usually describe tone with adjectives. Remember, adjectives describe nouns, okay? So we have sarcastic, hopeless, sympathetic. So the author's tone is sarcastic. The author's tone is hopeless. The author's tone is sympathetic, or the narrator's tone is sarcastic, hopeless, or sympathetic. So let's take a look at this passage and try to figure out the narrator's tone. Sometimes I went with my mother when she put flowers on the graves of my grandparents. The cinder roads wound through the cemetery in ways she understood and I didn't, and I would read the names on the monuments: Brower, Cadwallader, Andrews, Bates, Mitchell, in loving memory of, infant daughter of, beloved wife of. The cemetery was so large and so many people were buried there, it would have taken a long time to locate a particular grave if you didn't know where it was already. But I know, the way I know what is in wrapped packages, that the elderly woman who let us in and who took care of Miss Brown during her last illness went to the cemetery regularly, poured out the rancid water of the tin and receptacle that was sunk below the level of the grass at the foot of her grave, and filled it with fresh water from a nearby faucet, and arranged the flowers she had brought in such a way as to please the eye of the living and the closed eyes of the dead. Really powerful passage about the narrator imagining this caring for of the grave. We can get a lot about tone here based on where it's set and what the author, the narrator, is actually telling us here. So the narrator doesn't seem particularly tragically sad. He's not telling us that he's crying or that he's sobbing over her death, but he's kind of telling us, in this very somber tone. Like, I would use somber here, talking about the cinder roads in the cemetery, mentioning all of the people who are there who have died, kind of reminding us all that we'll end up there. Not with a huge opinion, not that he's afraid or anything, just that it's kind of matter of fact, but still very serious and somber as a tone. And towards the end, the fact that it says, to please the eye of the living and the closed eyes of the dead. Again, coming back to theme, looking at how, this is the end of life. There's no in between here. So maybe the narrator's tone here is very somber or serious. So that's an example of tone. And this is the last paragraph in the end of Love. Here are some tone words. I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of the key things to being good at identifying tone is having a lot of words to choose from. So you can refer back to this whenever you need to. Obviously, that passage isn't lighthearted or amused or confident or jubilant, right? These are some positively connotated tone words. These are some negative ones. I don't think it was particularly negative either. It wasn't obnoxious or angry or insulting or any of these other things. It was a little bit sad, but that's not the same as negative necessarily. We have, it definitely was not humorous. Tone words here for pompous or mocking. If somebody really is disdainful towards their subject, maybe someone really hates hunting. In my hunting example, they're ridiculing hunters, or the opposite. Maybe the people, someone who's writing an article that adores hunting is talking about how, in a patronizing way, about people who are tree hugger, deer hugger people. Those are some potential tone words. So if you're ever looking at comedy, come back to these tone words. This looks right for us: sorrow, fear, or worry. So I like the word somber right here. This is a good choice. I think that is a good way to describe what he's feeling. There's some other good ones here. I think it's less sad I think sad is too harsh. I think it's a little bit too objective for sad, but take a look at sober. Again, these words all mean very different, very much the same thing, right? Somber and sad are very close. But again, it's like my example with gaunt versus skinny versus slender, right? All of those words mean skinny, a thin person, but the connotation is different. So you want to look at, we call it shades of connotation, right? So you go more in the direction of very, very sad, right, with sad or despairing, and then less in the direction of that with maybe solemn or serious. So it's kind of like a spectrum there. Some tone words are neutral. So like I said, if it's a very clinical phrase, they're using clinical phrases. Maybe it's matter of fact, this one here, matter of fact. Maybe it's pretentious. That one has a kind of a negative connotation, but not about the subject. We might say, saying someone is pretentious is not necessarily that. If they're apathetic, that means that they don't care about their subject, which is interesting that they would write about it. But all of this is really worth taking a look at. Now, maybe you don't know what some of these words mean. That's okay. Use this as a tool to learn some words that you can use in your arsenal to identify tone. Mood. the general atmosphere created by the author's words, the feeling the author intends the reader to experience. And this may change, again, from situation to situation. So again, different from tone. You can hear how it's different. We're talking about before what the author means. This is what the author wants you to feel, the kind of atmosphere generally created by this. Now, sometimes it's referred to atmosphere itself, which I think is helpful because lots of times the setting has a lot to do with mood, and that reminds me of like the atmosphere and weather. Identifying mood. So a mood it creates the emotion in the reader through the following. The setting. So again, I keep mentioning setting. If we have this creepy setting, obviously we're going to have a kind of a creepy, haunting mood maybe. Word choice, so the connotation of the words, again, super important if you're looking for a mood. And then characters. How are the characters reacting to what's happening around them? Do they have this really kind of nervous body language, or they're kind of protecting themselves with their arms, or are they just like, oh, they're like throwing their hands up and they're excited and they're having fun? That is a really good way to look at mood, is to take a look at setting, word choice, and character. The plot also has a lot to do with mood. Whatever is actually happening in the story has to do with the mood. So if something very scary is happening or sad is happening in the story, you can just use that to help you find the mood. This is a lot less complicated, in my opinion, than tone, because tone is, you have to kind of figure out what someone else is thinking. This is what that person wants you to feel or think. So think about that when you're trying to think about mood. So let's take a look at the mood in this passage. Another example from William Maxwell's Love. This is earlier up in the story when two young boys go to visit their teacher. As we followed her through the front parlor, I could make out in the dim light that there was an old-fashioned organ, like the kind you used to see in country churches, and linoleum on the floor, and stiff, uncomfortable chairs, and family portraits behind curved glass in big oval frames. The room beyond it was lighted by a coal oil lamp, but seemed ever so much darker than the unlighted room we had just passed through. You probably felt the mood already. The feeling that you got was probably the right instinct, right? So let's take a look at if you had to support your mood. If I said, identify the mood and give supporting evidence. Let's talk about some supporting evidence. Key things for mood. Light. Any mention of light is awesome for helping you identify mood. So look at this. The dim light, right? Again, huge symbol in our lives. We know this symbol inherently. Very bright, colorful light, things that are easy to see. That's something that's very positive. This is dim light, right? We have this old-fashioned organ like you see in country churches. Hello, funeral, right? That sounds a little funeral-y. Linoleum on the floor, uncomfortable chairs. It's not a very comfortable place. It gives you this kind of eerie mood, right? Family portraits. Maybe these people aren't alive anymore, even these family portraits behind the curved glass in big oval frames. And then the next room is even a worse mood, right? A little bit even creepier or more unsettling. It's, even though it has a light in it, it feels darker. So this thing of darkness and light, right? That makes sense. Like, as early humans, when it was dark out, we couldn't see, the unknown frightened us, maybe people got eaten by saber-toothed tigers. So it makes sense for us to use that as a symbol in our modern times. So we see the dim light and then the darker light. That gives us a mood, right? This is a really good use of setting to give a mood. Mood words. I'm going to give you some words here, just like we had with tone. There's a little bit fewer, we have some fewer words here. If something is calm, cheerful, dreamy, lighthearted, silly, or warm, or joyous, or optimistic, those are great words to use for mood. There's a ton more. This is not an exhaustive list, but I gave you some to think about. We could also have a dreary mood, cold, anxious, somber, creepy, nightmarish, sentimental, sorrowful. When I say cold and warm, I don't mean it was warm outside, although that may factor into it. I mean it's cold or like shut off to emotion, right? Or warm would be very open to emotion and very safe and welcoming kind of place. So that's a little overview of tone versus mood. I hope that clarifies something that's often a sticking point for many students. Oh, mysterious too. Very mysterious it was last.